This is Let's Talk Energy, your go-to podcast for smart energy insights. I'm your host, Noah Brenner. Each week, we're bringing you an inside look at the dynamic shaping global energy markets through in-depth conversations with our own Rystad energy experts, as well as some special guests. In today's episode, we'll tackle the impacts of U.S. President Donald Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, as well as his trade policies on the energy industry. President Trump has made energy the cornerstone of his platform and quickly overhauled U.S. energy policy, beginning with his declaration of an energy emergency on his first day in office, through his ongoing negotiations over tariffs and trade policy, and the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Trump has redefined how the most energy rich country in the world produces and exports molecules and electrons. But are the so called winners of Trump's policy blitz actually coming out ahead? And will the losers really be pushed to the margins? And what does this all mean for energy companies, markets, and supply chains? I've got Mike McCormick, a partner in our advisory practice here at Rystad Energy, joining me in New York to break it all down for us. Mike, welcome.
Thanks, Noah. Happy to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
All right, well, let's talk energy. And so, Mike, you've been leading our team, which really is our entire global organization, in trying to organize and analyze all of these different policy signals coming from the Trump administration into a digestible report that we call Trump and Energy, which is now on its third edition. And so, this is a massive topic, but I was hoping you could just put some guardrails on our conversation here, frame up exactly what it is that we're going to be talking about on the program today.
Absolutely, Noah. So I think, just 10 seconds on why we did it, the report. I think it's, first and foremost, because we saw this pace of change happening in terms of domestic and international policy from the US. And that introduced a lot of uncertainty. And I think the report has been one of the widest read analytical pieces in the company's history. But I think what's sort of the three large buckets to talk about are the domestic policies and how that's taken shape really through the One Big Beautiful Bill, which was signed into law on the 4th of July. Um, the trade policies, which have really taken a 180 U turn in the past 6 months, and how that is actually beginning to coalesce for some trade partners. And then I think finally, I guess the second order effects of those trade policies, we'll take a look at that and what some of the longer term ramifications might be.
And so, I mean, it might be a bit reductive to try to call winners and losers from a bill that spanned more than 900 pages, I believe. But certainly, some industries have come out on top in this policy blitz, and others have certainly not fared quite as well. And so, I mean, let's talk about what seems to be consensus the biggest winner in these developments, which is U.S. LNG. So, how big of a tailwind has Trump been for the U.S. LNG sector?
I think just setting the stage or the backdrop for the new administration coming in, we had roughly 14 or 15 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas liquefaction capacity that came online up to this point. There's another 8 billion cubic feet a day of capacity that has been sanctioned prior to actually the Biden administration's LNG pause. And so we had a stage set for massive growth, regardless of the policy changes. But I think what's been really impressive to see has been the pace of sanctioning of incremental projects since the new administration took office. So I think we've added roughly 5.5 billion cubic feet of new liquefaction projects that are FID'd. They'll start up toward 2030 or just before. And I think it is a testament to the sort of coalescence of the policymakers and regulators to the sort of the aligned interest of the actual industry itself, and consequently, capital has really gotten on board quickly. It's kind of been the summer of LNG. Roughly speaking, I think the main takeaway is that the Trump administration has been an advocate for accelerating the export projects that have been waiting to FID for a bit more than 12 months. And I think the other piece that we'll probably get into later is the fact that this LNG wave is actually key to the context of some of these trade deals that are happening or might happen soon. So
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like the stage was set for this expansion, but the Trump administration has materially enabled further growth within that industry. And I do want to come back to those trade deals a little bit later on in the program. But I mean, has it been all positive necessarily, or are there other aspects of Trump's policies, whether you mentioned trade or tariffs, that might actually make it more difficult for US developers to realize some of those growth aspirations?
Yeah, I think it does cut the other way a little bit. And part of that is attributable to the administration, and part of it was actually just market forces at work. I think what you see is there's a big stack up of projects, mega large scale, 10 to $30 billion investments happening on the Gulf Coast across LNG, other parts of the energy value chain. Also have a lot of onshoring that's happening in heavy industry and other advanced industries. And so what we see is a big kind of stack up of large engineering intensive projects. So, as a result of this, we've seen cost and time overruns on EPC, that's engineering, procurement, and construction contracts, really blow out over the last 3 to 4 years. And I think with this incoming wave, it's probably unlikely that that will sort of normalize anytime soon. That's again not necessarily the administration's fault or doing. It's more a symptom of the pace of deployment of these projects. And then I think the more direct costs impacts can come from the tariffs. There are components of liquefaction facilities certainly that are imported predominantly from Europe, which may be subject to tariffs. Initial kind of worst case estimates, we put that in like a low teens inflationary impact. I think we'll see that that's lower going ahead as I think supply chains are moving quickly to support this. There are some winners domestically there. I think the other piece, and this is a long dated one, but it's potentially an important one, is there has been discussion of sort of building a domestic, meaning Jones Act compliant fleet of LNG carriers and potentially requiring the use of those carriers to transport US LNG. Um, Long story short on that is a costly and uncertain endeavor that will probably ultimately significantly increase the cost of transport of LNG if that were to happen. It's unclear to me whether it will at this stage, but it is something that we've talked about. So I think those are kind of the three things that are going against the gas, the LNG wave, so to speak. So
Well, I mean, certainly we've seen the Jones Act create issues in other industries. So if it was brought to bear in the LNG business, that would be something to pay a lot of attention to. But I want to talk about, it wasn't all winners out of these policies. I mean, I think everybody can understand. I think everybody can agree the biggest loser was the offshore wind industry. It's hard to even know where to begin, whether it's canceling permitting, actually stopping certain approved projects. Getting rid of some of the tax credits that industry enjoyed through the Inflation Reduction Act. But I mean, how much of an impact does this have on our outlook for the sector?
yeah, speaking of Jones Act, I guess good transition there. But I think the offshore wind sector, it is the biggest loser in the sense that there is, I would say, proactive, concerted effort to curtail the development of that technology in the U.S. Um, as you alluded to, we see essentially permits being pulled for mature, even advanced stage construction projects. I think there are legal challenges that will happen that are probably, on a decent basis to sort of resume those projects that are already being built. But I think realistically, sort of the best case scenario for the offshore wind industry in the U.S., barring a big change in stance by the administration, is that we will see the completion of the post FID projects, but we won't see any incremental sanctioning. So it's bare minimum a 4 to 5 year delay to even start considering taking an investment decision on those projects. I think it could be more structural if there is a degree of uncertainty that even if you have two administrations in the future, there could be waffling on support for offshore wind, and so that's going to be a challenge that I think investors and developers will need to work through. So it has been really really challenging for offshore wind. I think maybe jumping to so what on that one. I think and I sort of learned this from a client that's heavily involved in the space, but it's instructive to think about the cost of not deploying offshore wind. And I think offshore wind needs to be seen in the context of the places where it was and is happening in the U.S. and that are primarily the East Coast, which actually has the highest electricity prices or some of the highest in the country. We're talking 30 cents plus a kilowatt hour for retail. In New England. And so, this offshore wind piece actually is fairly competitive in the context of those power prices. It certainly isn't something that makes sense in the Gulf Coast, for example, where you have really low power prices. But so, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative so far in lieu of offshore wind has been importing LNG, and that imported of LNG has been coming from other countries because of the Jones Act. So there's a theme happening here. Um, but I think the other alternative, and it is a good one if it pencils, is building incremental transmission assets for natural gas out of the sort of gas rich Pennsylvania, Ohio region up into the Northeast. And so we've seen that come up in the context of offshore wind. I think that we really, we do see that there's now support. There has been policies really making that impossible for the last decade or so. I think that it's now a question of economics and of willingness to accept, the cost risks associated with that project. And, the question by, say, utilities that are going to generate gas power using that gas of whether or not there will be a need for that gas in the long term, and being willing to be offtake for those projects. So it is a bit of a question of whether those projects will make sense economically. And that's what we wait to see.
Still got to compete in the market. And so this actually brings us nicely to another winner, which was the upstream U.S. oil and gas industry. I mean, we saw reduced royalty rates. We've had promises of the largest lease sales in U.S. history, I believe, in Alaska and along the Gulf of Mexico, and the scrapping of the methane fee that many large companies were in favor of, but many small ones felt like they would struggle to comply with. And so does any of this kind of package of policies actually move the needle for us on U.S. production for how we're thinking about it?
Yeah, I think, strictly speaking, maintaining or improving the tax code for bonus depreciation, um, lowering royalty payments, those things do help the industry on the margin. Our analysts sort of pencil that at a few dollars, maybe maximum a few dollars reduction in the break even price for oil production out of the U.S. So it is marginally helpful. It doesn't move the needle fundamentally. It doesn't reposition U.S. oil on the cost curve, more competitively, frankly. I think the biggest benefits that the natural gas production industry is waiting for have yet to come, and that's via sort of permitting reform. Again, back to the pipeline question: can you build things again? But I think broadly speaking, yeah, these policies help, but they don't really help in the context of the macroeconomic environment and the fact that OPEC Plus has brought significant volumes back onto the market, basically reducing oil prices quite significantly since the new administration took office. And so, again, not the direct impact from the administration, but the headwinds from the global market are probably surpassing the near term wins on the domestic front.
Okay, well, let's talk about. I mean, all that oiling. Well, all the oil being refined into gasoline. Brings us to our next potential biggest loser, which is electric vehicles. The electric vehicle tax credit has been scrapped. Or will be scrapped quite soon, coming up here. And incentives for building out charging infrastructure that were in the IRA have also been curbed. And so, does this change our estimate for US EV uptake, say, over the next 5 or 10 years?
The short answer is it does. I think that estimate has also been a moving target for some time, regardless of the tax credit. But I guess for
Sure.
context, we about 1 in 10 of light duty vehicles purchased today in the U.S. are electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids. Um, our latest forecast following this new repeal of the credit is that about 1 in 5 by 2030 will be EVs or hybrids. And I think it's fair to say that's quite a reduction from our views, say, 2 to 3 years ago. We actually observed weakening adoption of EVs, meaning their share of sales, well before the election, even. And so I think there's some structural differences in the U.S. market, which we're still contending with, and that I think the both the infrastructure on the charging and also the EVs in terms of their cost need to continue to evolve in order to sort of accelerate that adoption. Um, yeah, so I think it does impact things actually.
So we're likely, if I'm understanding you right, we're likely to still see growth in EV sales, but certainly not the level of growth that we might have predicted, say, right after the passage of the IRA, when we had these more generous incentives for both vehicles and infrastructure.
That's right, Noah.
Um, but what about, I mean, does that change our view of US oil demand in any way? If we've got fewer EVs on the road, maybe more ICE vehicles on the road, does that mean that the US is going to be consuming more oil?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, marginally, yes. But I think when you sort of square it against the global demand for oil, it's probably less than a tenth of 1% of an impact on global oil demand, which really is the kind of the price setter, which matters, significantly in the broader context. I think, the markets that still matter in moving the dial around global oil demand are primarily China, where more than half of LDVs that are sold today are electric or hybrids. So it's still almost an irrelevant market in the context of global oil demand, for sure.
So while it might change, what it looks like when we're sitting in traffic, the car that we're sitting behind, but it doesn't necessarily move global oil markets. That is going to be the pace of EV adoption in China, perhaps. So, but what about solar? I've seen, some mixed things on solar. I mean, how has solar come out of all of this policy blitz?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the industry itself, meaning the developers out there that are building solar and battery projects, are probably still shaking that out themselves. But in our worldview, and what we see in sort of near term activity is that first of all, the tax credits, the PTC and ITC, are being repealed. That said, there is a window of more than 12, roughly 12 months to get projects under construction to qualify for those tax credits. So I think what we see now is probably a scramble among advanced stage projects to get to the stage, which, by the way, the stage isn't fully clarified as to what that will be yet, that you need to
Mhm.
be at. So that's the short term. I think in the long term, it does impact the more marginal solar projects. It probably impacts some of the rooftop solar to a degree as well. I think on the utility side, we see roughly 20% downward revision in our forecast of installed capacity for the next couple of years. But that is, still a massive and record setting pace of installation. So we really see solar playing a huge role on the basis of its sort of unsubsidized costs and value that it brings to grids. And I think that's sort of the story there is much more positive than wind, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, and perhaps driven more by technology and market forces, and less by policy than some of the other transition technologies, particularly offshore wind. But I do want to touch on some of those other transition technologies and as well traditional energy sources. I mean, anything you want to highlight on these, we'll just kind of quickly ping pong through some. Coal. Trump often speaks very highly of coal, but has he really done anything to boost the outlook for U.S. coal?
The answer is yes, and I think that will play a role, in extending the life of coal on existing assets, power generation assets primarily. We will see some of the projects, that maybe were um, slated for retirement being extended in the future. But I think the real underlying reason for that is much more the the world that we live in here in the U.S. now, which is 2+% annual growth in electricity demand, and consequently likely higher capacity prices to maintain that existing equipment, and also power prices themselves, at least in the sort of the next 5 year term. So we do think that industry will have a bit more running room. I think what we don't see is any evidence to see there'll be major capital investment in new coal power generation. You might see marginally more supply though that could be exported.
Okay, so at least here, what we've got might run a little bit longer, but that's going to be driven by the trends that we're seeing in the power market, rather than maybe as much by specific policies. But what about nuclear and geothermal? Two technologies we hear a lot of quite a bit about, but not necessarily producing as many new electrons as as perhaps headlines maybe.
Yeah. Starting with nuclear, I think, and the interesting thing actually first about both of these technologies, I think there's bipartisan and near kind of global support now for both of these technologies. And so the momentum is huge behind both of these technologies. And I think what's been done so far in the nuclear sector in the US around permitting reform and accelerating the permitting process for SMR technologies and even some traditional large scale nuclear projects is a structural shift from sort of the way that we thought about approving new nuclear in the future. And so I think that's a real positive. I think it's sticky, meaning it's bipartisan. But I still think that nuclear is a story of the late 2030s to early 2040s in terms of contributing meaningfully to this load growth that we have today. And not to mention the costs of SMRs. We see the learning curve analogs to solar, with the sort of nth of a kind SMR being very cheap. But I think we're less certain of that trajectory today, and so we need to see the data come before we start to see them really scaling up. In the U.S., I think there's plenty of opportunity and real runway in other places in the world. When it comes to geothermal, I think um, the story is extremely positive in the sense that we've seen a massive sort of paradigm shift in terms of the cost competitiveness of geothermal from the likes of enhanced geothermal, that are really, in the last, I would say, 36 months. We've gone from completely uncommercial or unproven low TRL technology to, potentially sub $100 per megawatt hour geothermal by 2027. Um, and it's really, really competitive. I think the challenge is there's a scalability issue that is being, heavily worked on by that sector. But for now, we don't really see large scale projects, going to FID really like east of the Rockies, right? And that's something we're eagerly awaiting. But I think you'll see a lot of developments there in the short term.
So I know there were some developments in CCUS as well, but I want to jump to batteries because I think there's some unique factors. A technology that generally has been supported, but I think there's some unique factors that might make it more difficult. So tell us a little bit about batteries.
Yeah, absolutely. So batteries are unique among, call it, the renewable suite of technologies that the tax credits were maintained basically in their original form, which is great in our view, and definitely a bolster to sort of the deployment there. Um, and we definitely see the need for these batteries almost regardless of the deployment rate for solar. Obviously, solar is to be paired with batteries in the future in most cases, but even absent a massive solar build out, the value that batteries bring to a lot of grids that are lacking batteries is massive around, providing services that, things like data centers need around the grid. And similarly, on the sort of behind the meter, co-located with load, they're massively, economically viable technologies that can help with peak shaving, with stabilization and quality of the grid. So we see a lot of run room on the batteries. The challenge with batteries, and it does play out as well for solar and wind, both for project development and for manufacturing, is we have these foreign entity of concern, I guess I'll use the term FIOC restrictions, which are now being placed on some of these technologies. And this is essentially a way of offboarding the US from using technologies that are coming from, I guess, economic adversaries is a way to put it. And so over the next 4 or 5 years, we have an increasing, more or less local content requirement for batteries, for solar panels, for all of these technologies. But in particular, the battery supply chain is the one where we see this being a huge challenge, just given the fact that we really don't have an advanced battery supply chain in the United States. And there's really a small number of companies that are quite vertically integrated, controlling that supply chain, and most of them are based in China. And so that's an issue.
And I want to continue with that. I mean, I'm really interested if if in the U.S. we're going to be buying a decreasing amount of batteries, solar panels, EVs from China as these FIAC requirements get more and more stringent. Where does that go? I mean, up until this point, we've kind of been talking about the impacts within the U.S., but I mean, where does this Chinese clean tech go, and what's the impact globally of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, from the US's perspective, right, this is about qualifying for the tax credits. And so to the extent the technologies stand on their own and you don't need the tax credits, it's no issue. But certainly the supply of Chinese, call it low carbon technology into the US will probably be less than what we would have thought before. and that obviously presents a huge opportunity in terms of sort of an oversupply of that equipment into other markets. And I think, I believe Yarand alluded to this when you spoke with him, but I think there's an opportunity there with Europe in a way that, with a solar panel, you buy one every 25 years, whereas with a cargo of some molecule, you're getting a recurring subscription based model, right? And I think so. There's an angle there where this available very low cost technology could be an accelerant to the transition in markets like Europe. The jury's very much out on that one, but I think where we see the strongest evidence is in developing economies, where actually, almost as if it turned overnight, we see massive trade relationships opening up among developing African countries, some southern Asian countries, really dramatically increasing their adoption of some of these technologies via imports from China. So we do think that there's a really positive story there for the rest of the world, and potentially, an accelerant on the transition.
Well, I remember seeing a massive amount of solar, I believe, installed in, I think it was Pakistan, and they were taking advantage of some of these cheaper Chinese solar panels to provide more stable electricity and cheaper electricity. But I want to talk about these trade deals that you brought up earlier on, because this is kind of the next evolution of policy. We've seen a lot of framework agreements, we've seen a lot of discussion about them, but not a lot of pen on paper. And so, which trade deals are you watching most closely? And maybe what are some of the energy related components that you think could pop up in those?
Yeah, I think it's worth, this was something that surprised me, maybe less so for others, but first of all, it's interesting to know that really the ink isn't dry on any of these deals other than the UK. And that country has a trade, we have a trade surplus with that country, we the United States. So there is, a degree of movement and uncertainty around all of the deals, whether they're announced or not. But I would say, from my perspective, I think the most interesting one that, from an energy perspective, is basically the Japan and South Korean deals in the context of, again, tying back to LNG, the Alaskan LNG potential. This is something for probably 20 or 30 years, maybe more. Alaskans have been thinking about, and companies and investors have been thinking about the potential to export gas from the North Slope, which, currently there is no gas produced that isn't reinjected in the North Slope or consumed locally for power and use. And so the question for me is, who and which trade partner or partners or private investors are going to be interested in investing in that project. It's a really advantaged location for Asia, but it's certainly a technically challenging environment to operate. I think we looked at, obviously it's an oil pipeline, not a gas pipeline, but the tap system, when it was built, the cost overruns were north of 300%. The Mountain Valley Pipeline in Canada, which is a gas pipeline, I think in CAD was a 60 or 70% cost overrun. So there are risks there, but it may happen in the context of trade deals. I think China is the big one that has direct ramifications on global growth and therefore energy demand. Very uncertain as to how that's progressing, but we know things are happening in real time. And then I think, this is a fun one. It's not that energy relevant, but it's certainly geopolitically important. I'm very curious how the Brazilian US story plays out. Probably 30% of the work that I have done has involved Brazil and Brazilians in some way. I'm not super happy about our, top of house disagreement at the moment, and I hope that's resolved soon. So.
Well, and obviously a major energy producer as well there in Brazil, and so relevant to our clients and the people we're talking with. But I want to talk about that. I mean, which of these impacts that we're talking about are perhaps seen as more structural by the companies and the capital that we're talking to? Which are the ones that are more long term? You might need to plan, shift a business around, and which of them are perhaps more short term, and maybe you're trading around that development rather than necessarily changing your business model?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, as we kind of already covered, I think a US that decelerates the energy transition and also pares back a lot of the onshoring and build out of local supply chains that were provisions in the IRA. That strictly speaking benefits China directly and in the long run. China is sort of the so-called electro state, but they're also the supplier to future electro states. And so I think that's really a huge factor that we're still kind of trying to figure out. Um, I think the other one is, we've been, what, 75, 80 years of a very globalizing economy, low trade barriers, and that's reversing now. Um, and I think that we've all seen it in the news, in defense budgets, in energy procurement strategies, but energy security and national independence on sort of dependence on other supply chains is a huge priority. And so I think that really will dramatically change the strategies of, call it, the energy poor states and regions of the world that are importers of other commodities from other countries. I think that's a huge just pressure to try to become more independent. And I think, domestically, unleashing American energy is really a good story of providing low cost energy to other parts of the world. But as a U.S. consumer, I think the degree to which we unleash it directly impacts the prices that we pay for these same streams in 10, 15, 20 years. And so, this rapid build out could ultimately have big implications on, natural gas prices, potentially other commodities in the U.S. So I think that's the things that I've been looking at as the really long term shifts.
Well, and maintaining those low energy prices are, both an election issue as well as an industrial competitiveness issue. And so it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in the future and how the U.S. balances that export opportunity with those domestic concerns. But Mike, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for breaking down a really complex topic for us.
Thanks for having me, Noah. It was great.
Let's recap. Trump's energy policies are creating real winners, such as the US LNG industry, as well as real losers, such as the US offshore wind industry. But the impacts on most technologies are likely to be mixed. These policies are changing markets and supply chains outside of the US as well, and could accelerate the energy transition, particularly in places like the EU, but especially in the developing world, as those countries take advantage of cheap Chinese clean tech. In the longer term, we could see an acceleration of structural shifts towards more protectionist trade policies, and we're closely watching the potential impacts to US domestic energy prices. Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Energy. This podcast is a production of Rystad Energy, produced by Laura Rodriguez-Skaug and Boda Oak. Check out the show notes for further analysis of the topics we've discussed today, and connect with us on social media. We're at Rystad Energy on all your major platforms, or touch base with us on the website. If you'd like to send us some questions or reflect on today's episode, you can reach out directly. It's podcast@rystadenergy.com. And don't forget to leave us a review, hit that like button, and subscribe while you're at it. Most importantly, don't forget to join us next week on Let's Talk Energy.